Okay, so this is a presentation on Operation Urgent Fury, and I know you've all been looking forward to this one. So, for the newly elected administration of President Ronald Reagan, confronting perceived Soviet and Cuban expansion in Central America and indeed around the world was a priority. The administration proposed a wide program of covert operations aimed at Soviet-backed regimes in Afghanistan, Cambodia, Laos, Iran, Libya, as well as Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and indeed Grenada. Now, the struggle for Grenada was in fact a watershed moment in the history of the Caribbean and indeed the Cold War. I contend that October 1983 was in fact the most significant moment in the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. This paper concludes that the US-led intervention was an accelerated regional process, the immediate trigger for which was the murder of Maurice Bishop. Now, Grenada in the early 1980s was independent, a member of the British Commonwealth, and a favorite tourist destination with a population of about 110,000. Grenada's significant domestic product was nutmeg, of which the island produced about a third of the world's supply. On 13 March 1979, Maurice Bishop's New Jewel movement, that is, Joint Endeavor for Welfare, Education, and Liberation, seized power in a bloodless coup, overthrowing the corrupt and increasingly autocratic Eric Gary, whose United Labor Party had been in power since 1951. Now, in Havana, Fidel Castro quickly recognized Bishop's Marxist government and agreed to finance the construction of a modern airport at Point Salines, actually the southernmost tip of the Windward Islands. American analysts believed the new airstrip, more than 9,000 feet in length and scheduled for completion in January 1984, would enable the operation of MiG-23s while also acting as a staging ground for guerrilla deployments to Central America, in particular Nicaragua and El Salvador, and potentially also West Africa. Here you can see a letter to Yuri Andropov from the New Jewel movement, and of course, Fidel Castro greeting Maurice Bishop. So you can see he's tightly integrated into the Cuban-Soviet Eastern Bloc. Now, Bishop, though, despite his avowed Marxism, by October 1983 was beginning to show signs of gravitating towards the CARICOM community and indeed the United States. In early October, Bishop met with Castro, but upon returning to Grenada on 12 October, was confronted by party hardliners who accused him of petite bourgeois sympathies, and then deposed Bishop after a conspiratorial series of Central Committee meetings on the 13th. Bishop was then escorted back to his government home at Mount Weldale and placed under house arrest, guarded by Lieutenant Callistus Bernard from Carriacou. Ostensibly, Bernard Cord was to become the new prime minister, but opposition to this move forced him to resign in turn in favor of emergency government by the Central Committee, now dominated by the army's Leninists. Castro, despite having met with Bishop only days before, sent a conciliatory message to the coup leadership. Now, the crisis on Grenada soon took a turn for the worse. By 18 October, 5 cabinet members, including Foreign Minister Unison Whiteman, actually the founder of the New Jewel movement, had resigned to join a pro-Bishop mob that numbered in the thousands. On Wednesday, 19 October, these protesters, now being led by Whiteman, freed Bishop from his house arrest, and together they marched to Fort Rupert, intending to seize back power. At this point, troops loyal to General Austin, including Callistus Bernard, arrived in armored personnel carriers, surrounded the mob, and engaged in a brief shootout, after which Bishop and his cabinet surrendered. Bishop, Whiteman, and 8 other cabinet members were then lined up and executed. The junta now was taking no chances. General Austin, therefore, declared himself head of a new revolutionary military council and imposed a 24-hour curfew, closing off the island. This effectively trapped the 1,000 foreign nationals living on the island, including 600 American medical students then enrolled at Grenada's St. George's University. Even Castro seems to have felt that the coup leaders had gone too far this time. And although he stressed a non-interventionist line, the Cuban dictator did dispatch Colonel Pedro Tortolo Comas to organize the island's defenses. Colonel Comas commanded on Grenada about 43 Cuban soldiers and 741 Cuban construction workers, many of whom also were army reservists. Comas organized his small army into companies to resist American intervention and deployed Soviet and Czech-made anti-aircraft guns around the island, in addition to blocking the nearly completed runway at Point Salines. Now, the Cuban defenses were focused on Point Salines, where the People's Revolutionary Army, which was about the size of a battalion, was deployed with a few motorized elements, as you can see, was deployed around the island. Now, for the Reagan White House and the CIA in particular, considering their extensive anti-communist operations in Central America, this was a golden opportunity to curtail Soviet influence in the Caribbean and to deal a major blow to Castro and the Eastern Bloc. This is the National Security Council, as you can see. The political planning process for the invasion, of course, therefore, took place at the deputy, assistant, and undersecretary levels, and from the military side at the J3 or operational staff level. On the 12th, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Tony Motley, convened the National Security Council's restricted interagency group, which began the planning process. Their idea at this point was just to focus on potential options, primarily looking at rescue options for the medical students to prevent another Iranian hostage crisis or something of that nature. The following day, October 13th, Constantine Menges, CIA's Latin American specialist and a notorious anti-communist hawk, likewise began formulating plans for a US-backed intervention, and national security staffers now notified the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon to begin their own planning process. The restricted interagency group reconvened on the 14th, with Tony Motley again stressing the volatility of the situation on Grenada. Over the weekend, the US ambassador for Barbados and the rest of the Eastern Caribbean, Milan Bish, began to receive reports of threats to the American medical students, which he forwarded to Motley and Doone Claridge at the CIA. To make a long story short, by the 18th, there were actually 3 separate crisis planning groups underway: the Joint Staff, Atlantic Command, and the State Department, all studying variations of the rescue mission, invasion, pacification, and so on. The restricted interagency group met once more on the 19th with Vice Admiral Art Moriu, assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in attendance. At this point, Vice Admiral Moriu pointed out that the Joint Staff Crisis Unit was working on the problem and that Lieutenant General Prilliman was monitoring the situation and in touch with Sinkland. It was decided to brief the Vice President to get National Command Authority for approval for military action. Now, given the relatively unknown nature of possible resistance on Grenada, the staff recommended 2 general positions. First, diplomatic negotiations followed by civilian airlift of the medical students if possible, or in the event of resistance, the deployment of Marine Amphibious Ready Group 184, the USS Guam Group, plus the USS Independence Battle Group, both in the process of transiting from the continental United States to Europe and to Lebanon, where they were needed. Vesey recommended using Rangers for the initial assault and the 82nd Airborne Division for follow-up operations. Now, Atlantic Command was really in charge here of the planning process, since of course this was going to be or it was believed it was going to be mainly a naval operation. General Vesey, with Vice Admiral Moriu, next briefed the Crisis Pre-Planning Group of the National Security Council. This group had been assembled by National Security Advisor Bud McFarlane, who had just come on board that month, and so was very new to this whole process, of course, but had been deputy before that. And the Crisis Pre-Planning Group was chaired by his deputy, Vice Admiral John Poindexter. These names, of course, will all be familiar from the Iran-Contra affair, which I'll discuss briefly in a moment. At that meeting, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Ollie North reiterated that the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit and the Independence Battle Group had just departed for the Mediterranean. Tony Motley wanted these forces diverted immediately, which again meant getting authorization either from Secretary of Defense Cap Weinberger or from the President, or preferably both. As such, the Vice President's Special Situation Group was convened on the evening of the 20th. Between 5 and 6 p.m. at this meeting, Secretary of State Schultz and General Vesey briefed Vice President Bush on the Grenada situation. Bush, who had recently visited Jamaica, where he had met with Prime Minister Edward Siega, approved the expanded mission profile, including neutralization of the Grenadian forces, with both forceful extraction and surgical strike plans also considered. Getting the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, that is the OECS, to formally request U.S. intervention was a priority. As evening fell on the 20th, National Security Advisor McFarlane drafted orders for the President that would divert the task force, although in fact Defense Secretary Weinberger ordered the diversion preemptively. At 9 p.m., General Vesey contacted Major General Richard Schultz, commander of JSOC, to notify him to come to Washington for a briefing the next morning. Grenada-related communications, at Lieutenant General Prilliman's behest, were now transferred to special category restrictions. Now, with hindsight, this move was in fact a mistake, as it cut key planning organizations out of the loop, including critically the Defense Mapping Agency. And at any rate, it didn't even really matter, because the story of these naval movements was about to break on CBS, followed by the Washington Post and the New York Times. So much for the American strategic deployments. What was happening in the Eastern Caribbean? Now, the OECS is the critical organization here. It had been established in June 1981 by the Treaty of Bessatare. The OECS heads of state convened in Bridgetown, Barbados, which was acting as an observer state, following the reports of Maurice Bishop's death. On 20 October, Tom Adams, the Prime Minister of Barbados, denounced the violence on Grenada and was supported roundly by the OACS chairwoman, Prime Minister Eugenia Charles of Dominica. The OACS met again on the 21st, where there was unanimous support for intervention. This meant invoking Article 8 of the 1981 treaty and requesting United States involvement in a multinational peacekeeping effort. Back at Washington, former Ambassador to Costa Rica Frank McNeill and United States Marine Corps Major General George Christ were ordered to fly out to Barbados, and they departed aboard a Gulfstream jet at 10:15 a.m. on the 23rd. This mission was important because they had to get written confirmation from the OACS that the intervention was approved. That was McNeill's job. Christ was there to organize the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force, which would come in later after the Americans had left to pacify and restore democracy. So a critical military diplomatic mission there. On Sunday, 23rd October, therefore, Prime Minister Adams formally appealed to President Reagan for US military intervention in Grenada. On the 24th, Prime Minister Charles returned to Dominica with Frank McNeill before the two set off for Washington to speak directly to Reagan, as we shall see later. As the OACS meetings were underway, some espionage was taking place on Grenada. Linda Flore, a CIA case officer attached to the US Embassy in Barbados, and State Department Consul Officer Kenneth Kurz, with David Montgomery, the British Deputy High Commissioner, managed to get clearance to land on Grenada on the 22nd, ostensibly to check on the status of the medical students, but actually to gain information on several targets. On Sunday, 23rd October, this group met with Leon Cornwall, a senior figure in the Revolutionary Military Council, and before departing on the 24th, Montgomery met with Grenada's Governor General Sir Paul Scoon to get his authorization for intervention, a risky proposition given that Scoon was confined to the Governor General's residence. And he wasn't willing to give written permission at this time, but he did convey his oral permission, and this was retroactively used as the justification. CIA agent Flore, for her part, used this opportunity to gather intelligence on the Salines airstrip and the Governor General's residence, amongst other targets, which was then relayed back to Barbados when the whole group departed on the 24th. The weekend of the 22nd and the 23rd was replete with these kind of astonishing developments. It was no less the case for President Reagan. On the afternoon of Friday the 21st, the president, with Schultz and McFarlane, departed Washington for the Eisenhower Cottage at the Augusta Country Club, hoping for a relaxing weekend of golfing. Reagan turned in for bed, but was awoken at about 4 a.m. on the 22nd by McFarlane and Schultz, who had just received news from Vice President Bush regarding the OACS decision to intervene. Reagan replied there was no way he could say no to this request. A teleconference of the complete National Security Planning Group was arranged for 9 a.m., and the oral request for intervention made by the OACS to Ambassador Milan Bish was relayed. Vesey described the two force options prepared by Atlantic Command, and Weinberger and Schultz emphasized that they should have a maximum effort instead of splitting up their effort into Ranger or Airborne or Navy Marine groups. Reagan was only on the phone for a few minutes, but his intent to carry out the operation was clear. "Let's do it," the president ordered. Adding, when warned that there would inevitably be political blowback, he said, "I can accept that." D-Day was therefore provisionally slated for Tuesday, 25 October. Reagan, for his part, spent the rest of the day playing golf, a normally mundane event that was punctuated in this case by the dramatic incident of the 16th hole when a gunman held up the golf shop and took hostages, including 2 White House staffers. As this New York Times clipping indicates, the gunman was duly apprehended after his hostages escaped. At approximately 5 p.m., another teleconference with the National Security Planning Group took place, and Reagan instructed the Joint Chiefs to issue the execute order for what was now Operation Urgent Fury. The Joint Staff then contacted Sinkland and informed Admiral MacDonald of the go order. But the crisis had only just begun. At 2 a.m. the following morning, Sunday, 23rd October, the president was awoken again and informed about the Beirut barracks bombing and the significant death toll, later reports finalized at 242 American Marines and 58 French peacekeepers. Following this report, the group of Reagan, Schultz, and McFarlane decided they should return to Washington. The National Security Council was set to meet at the White House to discuss the Lebanon crisis, followed by the grenading operation. Reagan was wary of the risks, both to the medical students and the American forces, but the Joint Chiefs assured the president that the risks were marginal, and Reagan now signed the National Security Decision Directive that constituted the formal invasion order. The potential for an increase in global tensions was real, especially given the forthcoming, shortly notorious, Able Archer exercise scheduled for the beginning of November. Reagan would therefore brief Congress, while the State Department worked likewise to inform the United Nations Security Council and the Organization of American States. The United Kingdom also had to be informed, given that Grenada was a member of the Commonwealth, and needless to say, Margaret Thatcher was not happy about this. Admiral MacDonald's staff meanwhile, were continuing to revise the operation plan. The US assault force would manage the first 3 phases and then be relieved by the OECS Constabulary Peacekeeping Force in the 4th phase, during which an interim government would be created. Admiral MacDonald briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the afternoon of the 23rd and proposed that Vice Admiral Joseph Metcalfe III, Commander-in-Chief 2nd Fleet, be placed in command of Combined Joint Task Force 120, which was the main invasion force. The Joint Chiefs, aware that the Navy needed access to consultation from someone with experience commanding combined operations, decided to appoint Major General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, then the divisional commander of the 24th Mechanized Division, to the role of Army-Navy liaison. Schwarzkopf, for his part, had assumed that he was being sent to Lebanon, and it was to his incredulity that he discovered that the operation was in fact the full-scale invasion of Grenada. The JSOC force element, designated Task Force 123, included Rangers, SEALs, Delta, and 160th Aviation Battalion, had received the notice to prepare on 21 October to be flown in by C-5 transports. The fully loaded C-5As took off from Pope Air Force Base on the evening of the 24th, and after landing early on the 25th, were ready to launch from Barbados about an hour before sunrise. Early on the morning of the 24th, Admiral MacDonald called a final meeting at Norfolk, where he was joined by the various task force commanders, the various task force element commanders, Major General Traubo, 82nd Airborne Division, Major General Schultz, JSOC, and Vice Admiral Metcalfe with Major General Schwarzkopf. At 11 a.m., after concluding this meeting, Metcalfe and Schwarzkopf boarded an aircraft for the flight to Barbados to meet Major General Christ and Brigadier Reddier Lewis, the latter who had now been designated the commander of the Caribbean Peacekeeping Force. Metcalfe and Schwarzkopf and their staff then transferred to Navy helicopters for the flight out to USS Guam, where they arrived just after 5:30 p.m. You can see here the United States Marine Corps order of battle. I didn't mention them too much, but they're obviously vital since they were going to conduct a major assault as part of the operation plan. At noon on 24 October, President Reagan met individually with the Joint Chiefs at the White House, who again expressed their belief in the success of the operation. Secretary of Defense Weinberger, General Vesey, and the other Joint Chiefs met with Secretary of State Schultz and the President to brief congressional leaders. For its part, the JSOC element had a number of targets to hit. The Rangers would capture Point Salines, Delta Force would secure the Richmond Hill Prison and Fort Rupert, while the SEALs from Team 6 would land at St. George's to capture and secure Governor General Scone. It is notable that JSOC's maps had been left behind in the scramble to mobilize, and USS Guam possessed only obsolete British charts. The Delta operators bought Michelin guide maps of the Windward Islands, which included low-resolution renderings of Grenada. If you'll recall, I think this was mentioned in the Clint Eastwood movie Heartbreak Ridge, which is one of the few films ever made about the invasion of Grenada. Part of the kind of mythos, the mythos of Operation Urgent Fury. The Navy SEALs of Team 6 carried out the first JSOC mission, reconnoiter the proposed beach landing site at Salines early on the morning of the 24th. Suffice it to say, the weather and sea conditions were not favorable, with the result that 4 of the SEALs drowned. Dawn was breaking by the time the SEALs were nearing the shore, and for fear of revealing themselves and thus compromising the mission, they aborted. A separate SEAL team, this one part of Team 4, meanwhile successfully examined Grenville's beaches and recommended a helicopter assault rather than a shore landing. This change of plans was approved by Metcalfe only a few hours now before the beginning of the invasion. The Rangers, Special Operation Forces, and the United States Marine Corps air assault began immediately afterwards. Resistance was, of course, experienced across the island, ultimately resulting in the loss of several helicopters. The defenders, following Cuban military doctrine, only briefly held their positions, mainly anti-aircraft gun positions, before retreating into the interior to prepare ambush sites. The Grenadians, of course, as I mentioned, were focused on the interior, whereas the Cubans were mainly concerned about the airfield at Point Salines. The American medical students at the True Blue campus were rescued shortly thereafter, and Point Salines was cleared, the Marines then landing to secure St. George's. The Grand Asnay campus was captured on October 26th with the loss of a C-9 helicopter, and the Calvigny Barracks was attacked by the Rangers on the 27th with the loss of several servicemen and 3 Black Hawk helicopters. This is probably the biggest disaster of the whole operation, although 2 Cobra gunships had also been shot down earlier. Operation Duke, the liberation of Cariaco, directly north of Grenada, took place on 1st November with the Grenadian militia there agreeing to parole themselves. And you can see the list of American casualties from Operation Urgent Fury there. Now, on October 25th, as mentioned, President Reagan and Prime Minister Eugenia Charles gave a press conference at the White House. Charles defended the legitimacy of the operation when confronted by probing questions from the White House press pool, and argued that the United States had been requested to leverage its unique military capabilities due to the OECS members lacking the military capacity to carry out the liberation mission themselves. A visibly shaky President Reagan echoed these sentiments. On the 27th, Reagan addressed the nation and compared the Grenadian coup and intervention with the great loss of life in the suicide truck bombing attack against the US Marine Corps and French peacekeepers in Lebanon, in addition to the Soviet shootdown of KL-007 in September. Again, you can see how dynamic the September, October, November period is of 1983 for the broader Cold War itself. On 11th November, the NATO Able Archer exercise in Europe concluded, and on the 14th, Castro delivered his 19 Lies speech condemning the Grenada invasion. In 1986, the Goldwater-Nichols Act was signed, drawing on lessons that had been learned from Operation Urgent Fury, which reorganized the Defense Department and created the new Special Operations Command, SOCOM. Major sticking point for the public had been the press embargo. The relative lack of independent journalistic coverage contributed to the generally negative international reaction to the US intervention. Although domestically, the Grenada operation was highly popular. This was demonstrated in some polls taken after the invasion. The government of Grenada was entrusted to Governor General Schoon and a 9-member council tasked with managing the return to parliamentary democracy. In December 1986, 14 of the leaders of the anti-bishop coup were convicted of murder by a Grenadian jury. The guilty parties appealed their sentences in 1988, and although the sentences were upheld by the appeals court in 1991, they were commuted to life in prison. And in 2007, the Lundy Privy Council threw out all the cases. General Hudson Odson was released in 2008, followed in 2009 by Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Coard, who then went on to write a series of books about the invasion. So here are some lessons for you just to conclude. The military operation, although controversial, was in fact very successful. The medical students were rescued, Governor Schoon was freed, and the coup leaders were arrested. Peacekeeping effectively took place until elections could be held and democracy restored. The planning process correctly provided alternatives until the crisis reached the point where there was no other choice. Getting the OACS on board was vital in this regard. On the other hand, the operation emboldened those same parties who would then go on to become mired in the Iran-Contra affair. As William Leo Grande observed, quote, "Within a few months of the Grenada invasion, the Pentagon began drawing up detailed contingency plans for direct military action in both Nicaragua and El Salvador," end quote. And of course, President George H.W. Bush would intervene in Panama in 1989. So since 1983, the Grenadian Revolution, the fate of the Grenadian Revolution, has been obscured by the end of the Cold War. Yet it is highly significant, as I think I've demonstrated here, and deserves revision and further analysis. So thank you very much.